this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Alone, unprepared and weak. These are the words often used to describe Britain's position in 1940, a narrative that has persisted since the end of the Second World War. But is that the whole truth? The reality might surprise you. Welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and today we're uncovering the fascinating story of Britain's secret defences during the dark days of 1940. Joining me is Andrew Chatterton, author of Fortress Britain 1940, Britain's Unsung and Secret Defences on Land, Sea and in the Air. In this episode, we'll be delving into the vital yet overlooked roles played by pillboxes, the Home Guard, auxiliary units and other covert organisations preparing to resist invasion. If you have attended We Have Ways Fest, you might have seen Andrew sharing his knowledge on this very topic. Andrew, actually what I thought would be interesting to start with, and as we were just touching upon this before we started recording, Britain is an island and there is a history of invasion threats. I know famously we haven't been invaded since 1066, though I think that's technically wrong, isn't it? I think William and Orange or somebody who invades. But throughout the Victorian period, we have threats of invasion, or at least perceived threats of invasion. I wonder if historically there are defences in place that are sort of there through the First World War up to the Second World War that are continually used, reused, built upon. You get to Dover and you have that. It goes back 2,000 years to the Romans, doesn't it? Dover Castle.
Yeah, exactly right. And actually, yeah, it does go back further than that. So the stuff that I focused on my first book was the auxiliary units and the highly secret civilian stuff. They're secret underground bases, they're operational bases. Quite a few of them are in existing defensive structures, so medieval castles or Iron Age hill forts, because a good defensive site is a good defensive site. That hasn't changed in 2,000 years. And actually, there's the whole thing we have of civilian volunteers making up a defensive effort to defend the island also goes back, to the Napoleonic Wars. There was the local militia, which is essentially Home Guard, Dad's Army, as we have called it since. The local militia were made up of, where I am in Devon, there was a militia almost in every tiny village going around, and they were trained by regular forces that were in the country and not fighting in Spain or France or whatever it might have been at the time. So, in fact, and again, where I am, there's a Second World War pillbox on the mouth of the river by the beach, which during the Napoleonic period was the site of a cannon. So again, a good defensive site is recognised by military as a good defensive site. That doesn't necessarily change from 1805 to 1940. So yeah, lots of that. And as you're saying, and a period which doesn't get a lot of interest, or certainly piques my interest because I'd not really come across them, was this during the Victorian period, during the kind of 1850s, there was a renewed threat from France, and this whole kind of Victorian rifle volunteers were started up, which again was very similar to the militias of the Georgian period. They started practicing, and they were given full uniforms and used the same defensive structure. They tended to be a bit more, I think they're a bit more upper class than the militia had been, and they tended to recruit not so much the yokels, but slightly upper class people. But nonetheless, a long history of this country ready for, as you say, not invaded, but ready for invasion, made up of civilian groups using defensive ideas and locations that have been in place for thousands of years.
Yeah, you've got those Palmerston Follies, haven't you? They're built around the Cinque Ports, those forts.
That's it, Cinque Ports. Yeah.
Something else that I bumped into a few years ago, or relatively recent, depending on how you look at it, is that all that invasion literature, Battle of Dorking, that is end of the Victorian period, turn of the 20th century, where Britain perceives it's going to be invaded at any point. And it somehow seems sort of slightly farcical until the sort of First World War happens, and you can see everyone thinking, "Oh, well, maybe we could, maybe we couldn't. I don't know. Are we protected?"
Yeah, and actually, the First World War, as you can say, sees the formation of this volunteer training corps, which again gets barely any limelight at all, but is essentially the Home Guard of the First World War, made up of the same types of people. So those too old or in critical war work, they get the same abuse as the LDV stroke Home Guard got. So they were called the Volunteer Training Corps, but they had the George Rex, they had GR on their armbands. That's what they had, and they were called Genuine Relics for the GR or George's Rex. You know, the same kind of thing as Look, Duck and Vanish, all the same abuse that the LDV and the Home Guard got, the VTC got in the First World War as well. But again, made up of 350,000 civilians, not particularly well trained, not particularly well armed, but ready nonetheless for an invasion. And 350,000 extra men does make a difference to your defensive strategy. If nothing else, like the Home Guard, it frees up any regular forces you have in your home forces to do more stringent, more important jobs. So absolutely critical. And the VTC get no truck at all, really. Man, interestingly, have a huge influence on the formation of the Home Guard, which we'll see later.
But I wonder, coming out of that First World War and into those interwar period, obviously we've had the First World War. There is a possible threat to Britain. You know, the coast had been directly threatened and shelled during the First World War. Had any thought been put by the military into what an invasion might look like? You know, and certainly, you know, you could put, I was saying in the interwar years, you could almost take that all the way through to the start of the Battle of France, because up to a point, you're kind of looking at a potentially similar scenario as the First World War. So had Britain put any thoughts into what an invasion might look like and how it might be treated?
After the First World War, there was almost a banishment of thought of anything that might include deaths of more Britons. Because of the sheer death toll in the First World War, they didn't even think about it. There was a 10-year rule that they brought in place that money just wasn't going to be spent on the forces in any great extent, and that was renewed every year. So it was just continually pushed back and back and back. And it wasn't really until the beginning of the war. So at the beginning of the war, Second World War, so September 1939, that a chap called Sir Walter Kirk came in as C&C Home Forces, and he began to think a little more seriously about what defence might look like for an invasion threat. But he was all about attack is the best form of defence. He actually said that he didn't want anything like the VTC. He didn't want anything that was bogged down purely in home defence, but would rather be out taking the battle away from the country and fighting on the continent. But like all of these things, he also had a just-in-case plan. So despite how determined he was on his angle, he had a just-in-case plan, which was the Julius Caesar plan, which was ironic because Julius Caesar did invade. But he actually started to think about what forces could remain in this country to defend. Again, certainly until the fall of France, or the near fall of France, he wasn't particularly keen on bringing civilians in, and it was based around actually the territorial army and the regulars that weren't in the BEF. And you have to remember, at this point in the beginning of the war, Germany's a long way away. Like the threat from Germany is perceived to be a long way away because they are nowhere near the coast. Potentially, they've got the small gap underneath the Nordics, but that's essentially it. It's actually a very different defensive plan to the one they'll actually need when the Germans are on the shores of Belgium and France and Holland. So he did start to think about it, but the fall of France really, or the near fall of France, as it became clear that France was not going to survive, was the game changer, because then suddenly they're essentially on your doorstep and you have to completely rethink about what your strategy looks like.
I think the thing about the fall of France is not only they're on your doorstep, you've suddenly seen airborne troops used for the first time, and suddenly the Royal Navy are not necessarily being able to protect your front line. And added to that, the bomber will always get through. Now, they're not bombers, but the planes that they're on will always get through. So presumably there's an assumption that some will always come down somewhere.
You know, it's really easy for us to look back in hindsight and say that Operation Sea Lion was never, ever going to work. And it wasn't ever going to work. But from the British perspective, and certainly from a civilian perspective, Germans looked completely unstoppable. They looked like an absolute machine. France had the largest and most mechanized army at the beginning of the Second World War, and they'd just been smashed in 6 weeks. It looks like Germany are unstoppable. And, we do have the moat of the Channel, which is a really handy defensive structure. But nonetheless, they look unstoppable. So, yeah, absolutely, the threat of invasion looked like it could happen at the invasion could happen at any point.
Now, I vaguely tried to keep to a timeline, but I might just break it here because things start happening quite fast around the Battle of France. Kirk's retired, which I thought was odd. You're taking somebody out of when you're needing men, and Ironside is cross-promoted, demoted from Chief Imperial Staff. It's an interesting one to sell to him. We're going to give you a new job as Commander-in-Chief Home Forces. So it is or it isn't a combat role. Anyway, or is that a reflection of how important Britain under threat suddenly is when Ironside is removed as Chief of Imperial Staff? Again, removed might be loading it against him.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think they must have PR'd him a lot because he doesn't seem to recognise the fact that it does seem to be certainly at best, a side promotion. I think his move is for a few reasons. One, he doesn't like the French at all, so isn't actually that good at advising the BEF in France because he hates the French. So not a particularly useful chap to be out there at quite a difficult time for the French, when the French are probably doing everything that he, in his mind, thought that they probably would anyway. So he's not great out there. So bring it back. Also, he's a very recognisable face. He's 6'4". The general public know who he is. He's not a Walter Kirk who's kind of sat at the back in the office, the desk. No one knows who he is. It has to be a face that people recognise and trust. And Ironside is that bloke. Yeah, they do bring it back from as you say, a slightly sideways promotion, but nonetheless, I think is a good promotion. One, he's got excellent contacts. He's obviously got lots of experience, and since the war, actually, even during the war, he gets a lot of stick for his defensive strategy. I think he got it pretty right with the resources that he had to hand. So anyway, yes, it was a sideways promotion, but I think for a few reasons.
It is. I mean, he does get a lot of criticism, but I suspect, thinking about it, it might be to do with it. It's so fast. Is this pace of things in that summer of 1940? So he takes the job at the start of May. So Battle of France is still fighting. So the BF is not available to him to defend Britain, which means what does he have? What challenges does he face in his pack of cards to defend Britain in that May of 1940?
Yeah, because of Kirk's attack is the best form of defence. Basically, bugger all, because everything, the cupboard is pretty bare essentially in terms of forces. Saying that, he does have a few key divisions, particularly in the kind of south and southeast corner, of regular troops or TA troops. So the narrative that's built up since the end of the Second World War is that Britain was only defended by Corporal Jones and Captain Mannering. That was our only defence, apart from Spitfires. That was our only defence, and that literally could be further from the truth. Except for when Ironside took over, it's much nearer that truth, but not completely that truth. And he did have lots of divisions of regulars. They get barely any recognition in the defence of Britain. Regulars and TAs played an incredible part. The Home Guard and to an extent more recently the auxiliary units have been pushed forward as this last line of defence. They would have, they were the one. It wasn't those guys. It was the regular soldiers that were the last line. And even after France fell, and we got, I think about 300,000 odd troops came back. About 220 odd thousand were British. That's a big increase in the number of troops got available, which is great, but all your transport, all your mobility is left, or pretty much all of it. And so Ironside had to come up with a strategy quickly that allowed him to effectively defend the country with very, very little mobile reserve. And I think he did it well. I guess we can go onto stop lines and pillboxes and things, but if you drive past a lonely pillbox in a field, that ticks all your boxes about your perception of Britain in 1940. A bit half-assed, a bit crap, what good is it actually going to do? It's like insanely suicidal. That's what it looks like. But what you don't see within a kind of wartime context is actually this pillbox is firstly camouflage. So it's not just standing out there, hi, come and shoot me. Two, it's got slit trenches all around it. It's connected to other pillboxes and gun emplacements that probably have been destroyed or are hidden. It's actually part of this much wider defensive strategy. It's not just sitting there on its own, filled with Dad's army with pop guns and spears. It's actually an effective strategy. And actually, stop lines and pillboxes are essentially built because of our lack of mobile reserve. And this is where Ironside gets a lot of criticism. And it's not about static defense. It's not about the trench warfare mentality of the First World War, which he gets criticized for. And again, this goes back to defensive strategies from thousands of years ago. In an Iron Age hill fort, you've got defensive structures, boundaries that push the attacker in the direction that the defenders want them to go. So when they arrive at that set point, they are then hit with arrows and pebbles and what else. This is what stop lines and pillboxes do. The German army will always naturally find the easiest route through. So if they come up against a defensive structure that's given them some jip, they'll attack it, but also try and find the route through, and then they'll follow that easy route. So this is about pushing the Germans in the direction you want them to go. So they end up at a point where you, as GHQ, as the British High Command, can see the Germans coming there, and then you can utilize what you have in terms of mobile defense, and you can bring down your tanks and attack them in the place that you want to attack them, rather than the Germans just kind of flying through and you're having to disperse your mobile defense all over the shop. It's just not effective. So actually, I think Ironside, the 2 months, May to July, that he was 3 months that he was there, with what he had to hand, absolutely got it right. And if you look at the speed at which this stuff was put in place, it's incredible. It's absolutely mental. The Taunton stop line, which goes from kind of Bristol kind of area all the way down to Axmouth in the south of Devon, it's done in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, absolutely mental. Like all these concrete anti-tank traps, pillboxes, all the thinking about where to use it. And all the stop lines all over the country, they utilised a lot of natural defences, so rivers or mountain ranges, things like that they could utilise as part of the defence. But it's an incredible effort to put in place a defensive structure that would give Britain, at that point, the best chance of success. And this is, of course, if the Germans had got past the Navy, which they wouldn't have. But nonetheless, it's there in place very quickly. And I think the criticism that Ironside gets, particularly from Brooke, who takes over from him, is unfair, because by the time Brooke comes in July, the situation's, as you said, it's so fast moving that actually factories are now pumping out tanks, carriers, all the mobility that Ironside didn't have in May, Brooke is starting to have in July, which allows him to change the strategy into a much more effective mobile defensive strategy, which doesn't need stop lines and pillboxes. Yeah, so I think Ironside's been quite harshly dealt with.
It's where the nuance of those dates come in, and it's easy from a long way away to just see it as the summer, but actually those few months are crucially different. Things crucially change. What I've always been curious about when it comes to pillboxes and stop lines and tank traps that you could still see today, is there a master plan? How much was this devolved to the local area? Or is there somebody in Whitehall with a big map going, right, big line of tank traps, put a pillbox there? Or is it literally somebody in a local? I mean, how local does it get for the planning, or not local? How much agency do they have?
It's a bit of both. So I think the overall strategy and in general terms, the location of stop lines, and because it has to be in line with where your mobile defence is, and therefore pushing them up. So the overall strategy comes from GHQ, but actually specific locations has to rely on local knowledge. It has to rely on, actually, this is the best place, like the pillbox up the road in 1805 when it was. They knew this was a good defensive position, therefore it still is. That local knowledge is absolutely critical in terms of the placement of the specific placement of pillboxes anti-traps. But I think the general overall strategy of actually in this general area, we need something to stop them here or push them to the north or push them to the south, whatever it might be, comes from above. The specifics on the ground in terms of actual positional location of individual defensive strategy comes quite locally.
Who's building them? Is there, because we have no sort of total organisation that builds stuff. Is this just literally put out to hundreds of little private contractors, or does the military build them? Although the military would be busy doing other things, presumably like fighting in France.
Yeah, they are doing other stuff. But the military are involved in, engineers and Pioneer Corps are involved in the construction, but they do utilise local construction companies. Although there are lots of people, lots more qualified than me to talk about the various different types of pillboxes and other defensive structures, because there are a lot, and they all have their different niches. But even within that, they are localized. So for again, using where I am, a lot of the pillboxes, because we've got a big pebble beach, have been made up of pebbles. There's huge pebbles within the structure. So, and again, it's where the local companies are coming in, understanding what is available to them and the best stuff to build the stuff locally. They absolutely do utilize. And so it is that combination of military expertise plus utilizing local companies and their local knowledge as to what's going to be most effective, what we actually have to hand, all that kind of stuff. So it's a mass effort from civilian and military sectors. Yeah,
I always find them quite fascinating, because I assume that I could just sort of picture some military chap coming, right, we'll have one here, and then they have the contractor having a basic idea of how they need to build them, and then shuffling around those ideas to fit the geography. So whilst there is lots of variations of pillbox, actually everyone's completely different, because every contractor shuffled it about slightly different in the landscape. So there is no type or pattern that's perfect.
As you say, there are obviously designs that were sent around, and this is what it generally looks like. But of course, I mean, if you've got different contractors from all over the country building them, they're all going to be different. So yeah, absolutely.
Doing different things. Now we've sort of skirted over so far the Home Guard and the LDV. So Ironside comes in May, and this is the same time, is early May, mid-May, that the call for the local defence volunteers is put out. Now that's what I'm not. Now again, this is where the timeline is interesting. Does that call come out because they're deemed to be needed, or does that call come out because the government sees the country self-mobilising defence units? There is a perfect storm.
It's a bit of both. I think, and actually, I've slagged off Walter Kirk a little bit, but actually, he was, and he gets no credit for it. He was the first chap to start thinking about what a home guard might look like. So even though he'd earlier in the war said we don't want any kind of VTC like organisation this time round, actually, with France looking like it's going to fall, he's already started to think, actually, and when it does fall, actually, we quickly need to bring in another group. And it's not necessarily for fighting the Germans, but suddenly he's inundated with requests for, we need more troops to defend this airfield, we need more troops to defend this site, we need more troops to defend this site. And suddenly he's like, crap, I haven't got enough to do all this stuff, plus effectively defend. So we need to find a load more guys quickly. So he starts to put into place this thought of the LDV, and then he gets retired. So he gets no credit. He gets no credit for any of that stuff. And Ironside comes in, and then Eden does his broadcast on the 14th. And I think the other thing that we have to remember with this, and again, I love Dad's Army, right? It's fantastic, and I watch it all the time, probably too much. But it's not a documentary, and this is the key that's happened since it's the 60s and 70s when it's come out. Dad's Army does not accurately represent the Home Guard. The average age of the Home Guard was 35. This isn't Corporal Jones and Godfrey. These are generally quite fit young men in reserved occupations who probably have had some form of experience from fighting at the end of the First World War. Well, Dad's Army is weird because it's kept a force that was not called upon in the national consciousness for a long time, whereas otherwise it might have disappeared. However, the image in people's consciousness is entirely wrong. So it's a bit of a two-way thing. Yeah, the perception we have of the Home Guard is completely wrong. And if you look at the pure enthusiasm after Eden's broadcast, it's absolutely mental. And that is because, as you say, civilians have already started to form their own groups. They're fed up with not being able to do their bit. All over the country, kind of these unofficial groups are starting up, especially in areas where the invasion is likely, so Kent and Sussex and the South Coast. That these groups are already starting unofficially to start to train with whatever weapons they can get their hands on. And I think the government is concerned about this because it's out of their control, and that's not something that they're ever keen on. But also, suddenly, as Walter Kirk found out, there is need for a lot more men, because suddenly the men that we were going to be using for guarding airfields and things and looking out for parachute troops are needed to effectively guard the country. So a huge response. Within 24 hours of Eden's broadcast, 250,000 men had joined up. And if you compare that to the VTC in the First World War, through the length of the First World War, the VTC only had 350,000 men. So within 24 hours, nearly as many men were trying to join up to the LDV, as it is initially called, as were in the VTC for the whole of the First World War. It's an incredible response. And then a month later, it's like nearly 1.5 million. And then you get this whole thing of, well, why weren't they armed? Because 1.5 million men signed up within a month. That's why. And it was completely unexpected. Kirk was expecting similar numbers to VTC. So it's fair to say that Ironside was struck with the same problem. And what I found, actually, what I go through is these brilliant, very local Home Guard memoirs. So at the end of the war, when they were stood down, lots of these Home Guard battalions brought out their own, so the Kent Home Guard or Sussex, or even like specific battalions. Just the most fascinating books, if you can get your hands on them, that really gives a very local feel, not only to the Home Guard, but also how the general public was feeling at the time. Anyway, but what I found was that those in the really vulnerable areas, so again, that kind of southeast corner, loads of these Home Guards units were armed and patrolling within 24, 48 hours. They were fully armed, not necessarily in uniform, but had weapons that they could use. And around ports, around Portsmouth and Plymouth, Home Guard units around there were fully armed. So those in the most vulnerable points, or the most important points for defence, were armed. And then during the course over the next few months, so was everyone else, and actually a lot quicker than people give credit for. But a huge, an absolutely massive response. And like I said, it's not a massive response from people who fought the Zulus. It's a massive response from people who had relatively recent experience of fighting an enemy, and let's be honest, of killing an enemy. Like, it's all very well training, but actually having experience of using weapons in anger is a huge thing. And we're still young and fit on the whole. So the Home Guard is a very different beast to the one that we think it is. And their role isn't to charge headlong straight at the enemy with fixed bayonets because they don't like it up them. They had very specific roles around kind of identifying areas where parachute troops will be landing, because that's the main fear, is that from a defensive perspective, you can defend the crust, you can defend the coast, and you have like mobile defense in the middle to come and support that. If you've got parachute troops coming in and taking out telecommunications or water supplies or electricity, or blowing up bridges so your mobile defense can't get to the place it needs to be, that's a real issue. And you can't have regular soldiers everywhere defending that. And that's where the Home Guard come in. That's where their key point is, to defend their locality from parachute troops, and also to guard key nodal points, so bridges or crossroads or whatever it might be. So to start with, that seems to be their key role. So they're not fighting alongside the regular troops. They have a very different role. And again, it's that perception we have of the Home Guard is that there's no regular troops, and therefore these are the guys in the trenches who are going to be. It's not necessarily that they have quite a different role, and they would have been really important. And there's a lovely quote that I picked up from Mr. Bunting Goes to War, which was a book written about 1942, something like that, and which kind of sums up. It's a much better summing up of the Home Guard than I could ever do. So it's about this guy who, at the start of the war, is a bit complacent and not into this, blitz spirit and things like that. But as the months go on, he begins to see what's happening around him. Everybody in the train seemed to have volunteered for something except himself. They were mostly Home Guard, learning to shoot and throw homemade bombs, methodically preparing to kill every German who might get to England. They seemed to Mr. Bunting, in some ways, more formidable, even more than the young soldiers who'd fought under orders light-heartedly, but who knew their country only as boys. These older men were preparing grimly to defend things they'd cherished all their lives and meant to stick to. They would kill without compunction. That's a much better summing up of the Home Guard. And that was written in 1942, so a much clearer idea of what the Home Guard were about then, certainly than Dad's Army.
Dad's Army's like Blackadder to the First World War. Neither are documentaries, but almost be read like documentaries. What I do find fascinating about that point is that, there'll be 50% of men who are in reserved occupations. So clearly a large majority of those will be in the Home Guard. But as you point out, many will have fought in the First World War. So when you think about the First World War and the tragedy of the First World War and all this hand-wringing about not wanting to go to war, actually those men volunteer again for the Home Guard. Again, that Blackadder idea of the First World War is partly disproven by the fact that men come forward during the Second World War to fill the ranks again, knowing what war looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, correct. Absolutely. And at a point where many of them also have wives and kids, which might have been different from their experience during the First World War when they were obviously a lot younger. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That was the other thing that occurred to me about Dad's Army is I was reflecting back upon the episodes of Dad's Army, and it's the problem with Dad's Army is there is a lot of truth, but scattered over 10 years of series. So when they're making tanks out of bathtubs, that might have been in a very tiny period where they have no kit. But in Dad's Army, at that point, they've all got kit because there's only a short period. So there is tiny elements of stuff that ring true but doesn't function over the long period of Dad's Army.
So the Home Guard had their own guerrilla sections, right? So in the areas where the auxiliaries weren't operating, they had their own guerrilla sections. And there's an episode, literally, where Mannering's at some kind of event and the colonel comes up to him and says, "Are you taking part in this exercise of the weekend?" And he says no. And it's about the training major wants to bring the younger, fitter men into a guerrilla section. And he says about they go around and they'll be sniffing out ammo and fuel dumps. That's exactly right. And it's not something that's ever associated with the Home Guard. Exactly right. Pike doesn't get in because he can't find where headquarters is. You're right. There are elements of truth that give the windows into the real Home Guard in amongst everything else that are really quite interesting.
Because the curious thing, because the other thing, is it Arthur Ridley who's in Dad's Army?
Arnold, yeah.
Arnold Ridley. Now, he was in the British Army during the First World War, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was.
So he would be old enough to be in the Home Guard during the war, yet he actually plays being in the Home Guard when he's in his 80s.
He was, I think, and he was badly injured in the First World War, but I think he might have. And Fraser was a First World War soldier. I think he was in the Home Guard during the Second World War. Lots of them were. But you're right. They were in the Home Guard when they're in their kind of 30s and 40s, but they're playing characters at their age in the 60s, during the 1960s and 1970s, when they're a lot older, not actually reflective of even themselves. In the Home Guard.
Which, the exception of Clive Dunn, who spent his career playing an 80-year-old when he was in his 30s.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
Which is completely odd. Now, Ironside doesn't last long in that job. Brooke comes back. Brooke is in Southern Command, and then he takes over Ironside's job. What's Brooke's view? Because he starts then quickly to reorganise, and this is, when is this? Is this July again? This is a very compressed timeline. Yeah,
July. So he comes in July, and as we've said, I mean, he immediately slates Ironside's strategy and undoes it. But by July, the amount of equipment that Brooke can get his hands on that wasn't available to Ironside just 2 months previously is monumentally different, and allows him to bring in a defensive strategy that's more modern, that utilizes the mobility that he can now have because the factory had been turning out all these tanks. I mean, not fantastic quality, but at this stage of the war, the German tanks were pretty crap as well. So actually, he was able to pull apart the stop lines to an extent and bring in a mobile strategy that was going to be, yes, absolutely effective against the German invasion, but only because he had infrastructure and resources available to him that Ironside just didn't have. And you're right, because it's such compact periods, people just people forget the amount of change that can happen at this stage in the war within a month, within 2 months is huge. I mean, the whole of the country is on a war footing. Everything's been pushed into it. So the amount of difference between Ironside taking charge in May and Brooke taking over in July is a great deal. He's also now got a much better idea of the number of troops he's got available, because everyone's back from not just Dunkirk, but from various other evacuations. And they're also now, by July, they're now back in a position to be into the front line. They're being armed because they've got over the horror of fighting in France and now ready to defend the country. So Ironside takes over before Dunkirk with nothing, essentially, because Walter Kirk sent them all over to BEF. And by the time Brooke takes over, not only has he got more mobility, he's also got 220,000 more troops. I mean, it's a completely different picture to the one when Ironside took over in May. And I think he's been done a massive disservice over the last 80 years. I feel for the chap a bit.
I'm usually very sympathetic to Brooke, but I can't help but feel it's a streak of Montyism to him that I took over and made it better, that has come through down to us through the years. And actually, Ironside was stuffed with what he had. He could only do what he could do. So Brooks puts his ideas to the test in the exercise Cromwell, isn't it? Which, again, I think isn't that also an episode of Dad's Army?
I think, yeah, there is an episode.
It's referenced in one of them. So this is Brooks' big plan. He tries it in September. How does that go for them?
So Cromwell is really interesting. So Cromwell is the code word that is sent out when the conditions are right for a German invasion, and it looks like the Germans are ready for invasion. This does not, and this is the important point, this does not mean the Germans are invading. There's a night in July, I think, maybe August, that there has been a huge increase in the number of barges in French and Belgian ports, a huge increase. The weather is perfect. The sea is calm. And so quite nonchalantly sends out the code word Cromwell to home forces. Now, those in the south and southeast have a pretty good understanding generally of what Cromwell means and what they should be doing. So what it essentially means is prepare and get ready. So get prepared, because everything's in place for a likely German invasion. Other units, particularly Home Guard, across the rest of the country were sent Cromwell almost as an FYI, more than that, nothing more than that. But they've seen Cromwell come in and they've gone, they're here, they're coming. And they start to act immediately. I'm surprised more of this didn't happen, but some bridges are blown up. You know, the Home Guard patrols are stepped up. The whole of the country is suddenly up in arms and ready to go, and in some cases taking action. Now, there's two things here. One, there's a sudden realization from Brooke and GHQ that they might need to clarify some of their codes and what that actually means and what people should be doing when they hear them. What it does also, and again, reading kind of local newspapers and some of these Home Guard histories, it almost acts as a reassurance to the public. The public have seen the Home Guard particularly join up and be, you know, armed in some cases and be taking part in the Sunday church parade and all that kind of stuff. When Cromwell comes out and Home Guard come out and are armed and patrolling and are proactive, lots of local newspaper reports of the British public saying, actually, that was fantastic. Actually, that looks really good. Actually, the Home Guard look like they know what they're doing. Actually, I feel a lot more protected than I did when I just thought they were old bloke, or blokes taking part in the Sunday church parade. So Cromwell's really interesting because it does have that. Obviously, it's a bit of a shambles, but from a public perspective, suddenly they've seen what potentially could happen, and they're reassured by it. They're reassured by the level of defence they have in their area. So I found that really interesting, kind of looking specifically into some of the regional stuff. That actually, I mean, generally nationally, it's as I said, shambles, but regionally, it's had a really good PR effect on the local population because they've seen what's going to happen. They've seen it in some cases, roll out as if the Germans were coming, and they're reassured that the defence they have in their area is actually going to be pretty effective.
So we have the Home Guard there to as defending our nodal points, sort of that crust. There's also auxiliary units. Now, are they're designed for if Britain starts to be occupied, aren't they?
That's the general perception of aux units, that they're the British resistance.
Well, I was saying not necessarily resistance starts to be occupied. I was right. Maybe not phrasing it right, but it's
a suicide mission. They've got enough rations for 2 weeks. Their role is an anti-invasion one. So in France and the Low Countries, as the Germans sped through, the spearhead kind of pushed on, supply chain kept them fed with everything that they would need to keep going. And they did it, as we know, quickly. The idea of the auxiliary units is to literally patrols of 6 to 8 men would disappear. Their wives, kids, families, friends have no idea where they've gone, to a secret underground base called an operational base. They would go in there, literally wait for the Germans to go over the top of them, the spearhead to go over the top of them, and then they would come out at night, and then they would start to hit the supply chain. So their role is to blow up ammo and fuel dumps, to hit key bridges, to hit railway lines, to take out country houses that have been taken by the Germans as HQs, to hit airfields, to take out British collaborators. Anything that slows down that advance, to make the Germans stop and think, what the hell's going on here? We need to deal with this before we can push on. That allows the British regular troops, which we talked about, because they're the main defensive force, to recover, to regroup, and then to counterattack. So auxiliary units are a key element within the defensive strategy. They're designed for a short, sharp snap at the heels of the invading German army, to pull it back, to slow it down. When you start to put this all together, when you start to put, particularly in kind of, if you say it's kind of June, July, before Brooke takes over, if you start to see stop lines and pillboxes and Home Guard and then auxiliary units, instead of seeing them as piecemeal, instead of seeing them as individual things, and you put them together in a full defensive strategy, suddenly it makes a lot of sense. You're pushing the Germans in the direction you want them to go. You know where they're going to be heading. You've got the Home Guard protecting noble points and identifying parachute drops and dealing with that. You've got the regular forces taking on the invading German army, and then behind the lines, attacking the supply chain, you've got the auxiliary units. So suddenly, it all starts to make a lot more sense from an overall strategy perspective. And the thing, the auxiliary units, they're only in coastal counties, so they're mainly in coastal counties, I should say. But they're the length of the country, so they're right from the Orkneys all the way down the Scotland, northeast coast, east coast, southeast corner, south coast, southwest, and South Wales. So there's nothing too much up the west side because there's no perceived threat from Ireland. There's about 6,500 men in the auxiliary units. They all signed the Official Secrets Act, and as I said, they didn't tell anyone. In fact, I'd say kind of 80 to 90% went to the grave without telling anyone what they were up to.
Were they spin-offs of the Home Guard? How do they recruit?
It starts off from two separate sources. MI6 started in about 38 with this thing called Section D that was going out to mainland Europe and advising countries on alternative ways of fighting enemies, which included resistance, but also included things like black propaganda and what we'd call now as fake news. And when it became apparent it wasn't the country surrounding Germany, because that was all a bit too late, it was actually us that needed something like that. The chap who was running it, called Lawrence Grand, came back and started the Home Defence Scheme, and he was liberally arming the public with weapons and explosives. And Ironside, when he got to hear about it, was not happy because Grand was just burying arms and explosives everywhere without really making much of a note of what he'd done with them. Anyway, and at the same time, Andrew Thorne, who was commanding 12 Corps down in that kind of Sussex-Kent area, was talking to Eden, Minister of War. So again, all this stuff links up. Generally about, the lack of mobility, but also he talks about his time in Berlin when he was military attaché, and he got to learn about the German peasantry militia, which is this group that had been around since the 1700s. German peasants would bury cash as a weapon on their lord's lands. A kind of enemy army would pass through, and what these peasants, lacked in terms of military training and numbers, they made up for in terms of their intimate understanding of the local surroundings. So they grabbed their weapons, understand the best place to ambush this army, and Thorne thought this could actually be replicated within Britain and be quite effective. So to cut a long story short, eventually they combined this stuff that Thorne had come up with, and the prototypes were run by Peter Fleming, the brother of Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, and they combined these two things to create the auxiliary units. And I'm getting to the point where I can actually answer your question. Sorry, they brought Colonel Colin Gubbins in to run it, who would later go on to SOE, and people like Billy Bates and Peter Wilkinson. People who have got a long history in irregular warfare. Lots of them have been involved in the independent companies that have fought in Norway, one of the successful points of the Norwegian campaign. And he started to stretch these to the vulnerable counties, as we've talked about. And what he did, and here's the answer to your question, he recruited lots of intelligence officers. Again, those that had fought with him in Norway, the independent companies, and people who had affiliation with a county. So he would send them off with a Humber snipe, a driver, and essentially a free hand. They'd go to the county, they'd see where the key point would be to have one of these patrols. So in East Devon, where I am, all the patrols set up in 1940 are in a line about 5 miles inland, so they don't get caught up in any initial wave of invasion. And they are between the main road running out of the southwest to the southeast, and to the south, and to the north is the railway line. And they're in a line like that. So those are their key targets initially. The IO would then go into a village on this line and identify a key man. So who would become the patrol leader. So someone with a bit of sway in the area, so a farmer or gamekeeper, something like that. But again, has that kind of intimate knowledge of the local surroundings. And then it's up to the patrol leader to recruit his own patrol. So another kind of 6 or 7 men he would recruit. And because of the secrecy surrounding the auxiliary units, he would choose people that he trusted. So friends, family, colleagues. Again, they'd all have this knowledge of the countryside. Would be farmers, gamekeepers used to killing stuff, used to handling weapons. In South Wales, miners who are used to handling explosives, or in the northeast, quarrymen, people like that. So lots of examples of gamekeepers becoming patrol leaders and recruiting poachers, right? Because they understand that the poachers know the countryside around them, can set traps, can steal stuff, can move stealthily around the countryside. So these guys are all set up, and they would only become operational as the Germans entered their town or village. So then they would disappear. But if you think of that from a family perspective, I would have to disappear here and leave my wife and my 2 girls at a point when the enemy army are entering my town, which is mental. Because not only are you leaving them, but also suddenly there's a huge spotlight on them because, well, where's Andrew gone? Why is that, So but they didn't know anything. So they were told nothing. They'd disappear and they go to their operational base, which are the most remarkable structures that we're still finding intact today. They're just incredible things. Again, like pillboxes, there's a standard design, but all of them are different because depending on the location and the geography. But generally, there's a hatch that's flush to the floor with some kind of debris on top, foliage or something like that. And then there's various ways of opening the hatch. So it might be on a counterweight system. So you stamp on the hatch and it pops up and swivels around and there's a ladder going down. It might be that each member of the patrol has been issued with a different coloured marble, and they'd roll that marble down what looks like a mouse hole, but it rolls underground and rattles in a tin, and lets the chaps down there know and they can open it up. Or you might pull a tree, what looks like a tree root, and that either activates the counterweight system or it rings a bell and the OB in it and they can open it up. Then you kind of go down a ladder. Down almost like a chimney shaft, 12 feet, something like that. So quite a long way down underground. And then you're confronted with a blast wall, and that's there just in case the Germans have got into the hatch and dropped a grenade down, round the blast wall into the main chamber where there's bunks and tables, and that's where the patrol would be during the day. So they're there resting and planning for the next night's mission. Well, there's quite often a chemical toilet. There's a kitchen there sometimes with the chimney going up a hollow tree, so the smoke disperses at the top of the tree line. There's some storage. They stored their explosives in a separate location a few hundred yards away, usually because you don't want explosives in the same place where you're sleeping. And then there's an escape tunnel which kind of leads 60, 70, 100 yards away, 100 feet away, quite often to a water source to aid in your escape. The most remarkable things, and these things were built in 24 hours generally by Royal Engineers or Royal Engineer tunnelling companies. 25 men, one sergeant would go out there, build it, get it done quickly and get out. And again, it all goes to the secrecy. You don't want them hanging around too long because the local population say, what the hell, what's going on up there? Two, if the Germans did invade, you don't want them there in place building it. You also don't want local engineer groups building them. So in Devon, where I am, for example, you don't want a Devon group because if they get captured, they'll just take the Germans to each individual one. So they'll come from the northeast or we'll use Canadians, something like that. So loads of thought went into this. And once you're in your operational base, there's no outside orders. There's no wireless in there. There's no radio in there. You're completely siloed as an individual group of 6 to 8 men. You don't know where the next operational base is or who's in that patrol. At a reunion in the early 2000s, 2 brothers, I think from Essex, turned up. They're like, what are you doing here? They didn't know. They only found out in the early 2000s that they were both in the auxiliary units in neighbouring patrols. So probably only about 5 or 6 miles away from each other in their operational bases. They just didn't know that they'd never talked about it because of the Official Secrets Act. And then, as I said, they would come out and do everything to slow down that advance. And then inevitably, you have a very short life expectancy doing that kind of stuff because they're ordered to go out every night. You're handling explosives. You're taking out sentries. The Germans are going to make a concerted effort to find you. Not only are they making a concerted effort to find you, they are probably taking hostages within your local community. They're potentially killing people within your local community as revenge for the activity that you're taking out. So not only are these chaps having to be highly trained in being effective saboteur and guerrilla fighters, they're also, I don't know how much training they got for this, but from a mental perspective, the mental strength that you would have, not only to live underground for up to 2 weeks, which is pretty grim in itself. These things have no electricity or heating. It's pretty grim. Not only have you got that, but also the pressure of going out every night and committing these acts, knowing that it's going to have a direct impact on your friends and family is a massive pressure.
Andrew, we're going to pause there, folks. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Chatterton about Fortress Britain in 1940. Now, Andrew, we were discussing the auxiliary units, but they were only to last 2 weeks. Was there a plan for long-term resistance if Britain was occupied? I mean, was that even considered?
Yes. And this, again, all of this stuff, I think, goes against our perception of Britain, particularly in 1940. And it's something that's come out in the last kind of 10 years or so. A group called Section 7. So Section 7, actually, and it's the accountancy arm of MI6. There's another Section 7 with MI6 that was what would have been the British resistance had the Germans defeated us and occupied. So at this point, Home Guard's gone, regular army have gone, auxiliary units are certainly gone. The Germans have taken over Britain. There's some kind of Quisling in charge, and it's occupied. And that's when Section 7 starts to operate. Section 7 has a few roles. It seems that they are there to observe the occupying army. So what regiments in what town, what are they up to, where are they based? They're then feeding this information back to civilian wireless operators. So in Matlock, there's a boy, essentially, who's been recruited. He's 14 years old. He's an ARP messenger. He's recruited initially as an observer. He'll take his information back to a draper's shop. So it seems that Section 7 recruited very similarly to the auxiliary units, where intelligence officers would go to an area, identify a key man or woman. And it seems in Section 7, they recruited people who could remain within their jobs after an occupation and were also in a place where it wouldn't look suspicious, where people are going in and out all the time. So shopkeepers, vicars, doctors, people like that. So this chap's was in a draper's shop. You go out the back, there was a disguised shelves. Pull one of the shelves, it'd open up. Behind there's an alcove where this wireless set would have been. There's 2 female, Mrs. Keys and Miss Swan, who were the wireless operators. So they would be sending the information on. We're not sure even where the information was going at this stage. Presumably it would be going to some kind of government in exile who would be gathering this information. It's very much like the French resistance. So they could move wireless sets. So this isn't the AUX units. This is about longer term resistance where possible. So, for example, in Miss Swan and Mrs. Keys had a grenade with the pin stapled to the underneath of the table they were there. So if the Germans came through, they could just pull the grenade out, throw it over the shoulders, grab the radio set, and get out the escape window. Section 7 is there for monitoring occupying forces, but also again carrying out acts of sabotage, making life as difficult as possible for the German forces. By the way, there's no paperwork apart from 3 paragraphs in the official history of the MI6, which references Section 7, with no reference as to where they got this information, but it's in the official history. So all this information we're getting in is from civilians. And the interesting thing, or from, families, the interesting thing is that one family story you have to take with a large pinch of salt. But when you get 2 or 3 independent families coming with very similar information, then you can start to join the dots a bit. So, for example, near Leeds in Yorkshire, we were contacted by a lady whose mother, Irene Lockley, said, more or less on her deathbed, I was involved in a British resistance force, and in my group was my dad, my uncle, my 2 cousins. Our HQ was in a cave just outside of our village in South Milford, near Leeds. Her role was she knew how to make Molotov cocktails, she knew how to derail trains, she'd been taught how to use the garrote, horrific, brutal resistance. And she was only 18, was she? 17, 18, so young. Her daughter, to start with, was like, oh God, it's a bit of a shame when they get to this age. But then she started to think about some of her memories from childhood. And one of them was, she remembers in the 50s being kind of stood in her hallway as her mother answered the door, and there was a pots and pans salesman, quite aggressive in his sales patter. He puts his foot in the door to continue the conversation. And the next thing Jennifer, this daughter, remembers is this pots and pans guy sailing through the air and smashing down into the front garden, pots and pans everywhere, because her mum, her little timid housewife mum, had just performed an unarmed combat move on this guy, right? And suddenly all this stuff started to make more sense as to what it was about. And the pots and pans salesman had made the same mistake as a German soldier would have made, that this unassuming mother, or at the time unassuming 17, 18-year-old, wasn't a threat, but actually was highly trained in all this stuff. So anyway, Irene Lockley's in her cave in South Milford near Leeds. We then get contacted by another family whose grandmother had said that she was high up in a British resistance force in Yorkshire, that her role, using her role in the WI as cover, was to deliver large amounts of weapons and explosives to these resistance cells. And she said specifically, I delivered them to a lot of caves in and around Yorkshire, which is exactly where Irene said that she was, in South Milford. So suddenly we got this link. Only in the last couple of weeks, I've been contacted by another family whose father, when they cleared out their father's, he was a GP and he died in the 90s. When they're clearing out his dispensary and his office, they found huge amounts of weapons, of explosives, of files of various acids, and they had to get the bomb squad out, and it was really. And what they also found out, which they didn't know, is that their father had been married during the war, but his wife had left him because she never saw him because he was always up to stuff, and he got married post that and had this family. So suddenly, within Yorkshire, we've got a guy with huge amounts of weapons and explosives, potentially sending them or getting them picked up by this woman in the WI, who was then delivering them around to sales that, including Irene Lockley. So suddenly we've got all this information within Yorkshire that points to a huge amount of preparation in a key area for a British resistance force. And very quickly, the other thing is that so it's not only the sabotage and monitoring of occupying forces, but also an escape line had been set up in the centre of the country using kind of 14, 15-year-old boys. So we've got the chap in Matlock had said that he met in Birmingham, all these other guys from kind of Birmingham, Nottingham and Derbyshire, and they all had code words. And when they would talk to each other, classically for Britain, they would talk about the weather. Their code words were all different types, ice or snow or rain or whatever it might be. And their role was to take as a someone had undertaken an act of what the Germans would have seen as terrorism against the occupying forces. They would take this person on the run to various safe houses up the centre of the country. And it was presumed that Scotland it'd be like France, that England, Wales would be an occupied zone and Scotland would be an unoccupied zone. And this escape line would run up the centre of the country and take these people into Scotland and then potentially away to Canada or the rest of the empire. So, yes, absolutely fully prepared, and we have no idea of the numbers involved in Section 7. It potentially could be thousands and thousands and thousands of people, because if you've got these three groups just in Yorkshire, Liverpool seems to have been another hotbed of British resistance, of First World War veterans, family. He was a sharpshooter in the First World War. He said he was involved in some kind of resistance during the Second World War, and that he was training teenagers how to be snipers in the tunnels underneath the Mersey. And then we've got another guy who would later join the regular forces, but during 1940 was part of some kind of resistance group, and his HQ was a newsagent's, which again fits with that whole Section 7 recruitment of key men who could keep their jobs going during an occupation. His HQ was as newsagents with a disguised thing out the back. It all links in. It's the most incredible story that we're still only, potentially tens of thousands of people involved, and we probably know like 12 people, if that, who have come forward.
The popular narrative is Britain is on a knife edge after the fall of France, but you make a really interesting point in the book about actually we're very, very good at playing down our strengths, Britain's strengths. We remember this underdog narrative today. Do you want to explain that? Because it's a really interesting point.
I think we have a weird pride in it. I think we have a weird pride in this perception of Britain of bumbling inefficiency, of being weak and unprepared and battling against the odds against this hugely superior military force as the Germans were supposed to be. What we forget is that in 1940 we are a massive empire. We are hugely, hugely powerful. We've got the support of the empire. We've got the support of the forces who have gone from their countries that have already been occupied. We have the most powerful navy in the world. During the Norwegian campaign, just the Norwegian campaign, the Germans sent 23 kind of capital frontline ships, and we destroyed or damaged 18 of those 23. We are massively, massively powerful. The Air Force, we have a plan in place that is perfectly in place to counter any, as it happens, Battle of Britain-like warfare. We've got radar in place, chain low and chain high. We've got bomber command, we've got coastal. And that's nothing to say about all the forces that we've got in land from a defensive perspective, all the secret stuff that's going on and pre-prepared. We are a massive, hugely powerful nation, and that's reflected in our ability to defend ourselves. And that should be our new pride. Our new pride shouldn't be on Corporal Jones and Captain Mannering. Our new pride should be on the fact that we recognized the threat very early, that we were massively prepared for that threat. And no matter what happened on mainland Europe and the BF and Dunkirk and all that little ships and all that kind of stuff, actually we were hugely prepared, hugely powerful. And yes, like anything, the Air Force generally wasn't in a great shape, and there were certainly disasters. But that's warfare. That's what you have to learn to. And actually, the other thing that we should have pride in is the way that we countered those setbacks quickly and effectively and level-headedly. There was no panic. There was no, I think James Holland talks about the most critical point of the war was when Halifax was trying to get a surrender via Mussolini. Churchill's determination to fight to the end was done in the full knowledge of just how powerful we were and just how prepared we were. And that might have not been reflected to the general public, because the British public, from a government perspective, you want a slight panic, then you can much more malleable in what you can do and what laws you can bring in and things like that. But actually, from Churchill, fighting them on the beaches, all that kind of stuff, he was in the full knowledge that we were massively powerful and very ready for any German attempt to hit us. So I think that should be our new pride. It shouldn't be about bumbling inefficiency. It should be about utter preparedness and actually, on what the auxiliary units and Section 7 also demonstrate is the utter ruthlessness and the utter brutality that we would have brought had the Germans even attempted it. It wouldn't have been and again, this kind of goes for our perception of Britain, particularly during the Second World War, cups of tea and sitting around reading the jolly good old chap and stiff up. It would have been utterly brutal. It would have been utterly, utterly, utterly brutal, and I think probably much more like the warfare on the Eastern Front in terms of our determination to defend the country it would have been an utterly brutal campaign. There would have been collaborators, obviously, but as a whole, I think it would have been, a powerful. The Germans never stood a chance anyway, but had they come, it would have been a very different defensive battle than most people understand it to be.
Do you think we've manicured that underdog image, even at the time when we were doing it, to almost, from an international perspective, to luring the Americans to help us?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. During the war, luring the Americans to help us and Lend-Lease and all that kind of, we're on our own, we haven't got... Blah, blah, blah. Absolutely. And then at the end of the war, when we're paying back the loans, that's a much better narrative to have than to say that we had this massive empire. And we're usually much better narrative to say we were poor and weak and unprepared. So yeah, it's absolutely manicured from the end of the war, and then built upon from people's perceptions of Dad's army and things. And then during the 70s and 80s, you got the kind of slightly declinist view of British historians who are taking a very kind of declinist view on Britain's ability, or Britain's armed forces, and almost bigging up the Germans in their lush uniform and big tanks, even though they're an absolute nightmare to maintain. All of that stuff has come together to have this. No, it's not a narrative; it's a national pride in efficiency. And then as you're driving past a pillbox, that backs it up. As you're watching Dad's army, that backs it up. There's not a lot out there. The auxiliary units aren't well known. The Section 7 is no one knows about. So there's a lot of stuff that people just take on that surface layer that backs up their view, understandably. But yeah, the point of the book and the point of the Cold Seal Auxiliary Research Team and all the work we do with trying to research these secret civilian groups is to change this perception and to have a better informed understanding of what Britain was like.
Yes, it is good to challenge these perceptions we are seemingly stuck with. Thank you, Andrew. Well, that's all for this episode of the World War II podcast. Don't forget to check out Andrew's book, Fortress Britain 1940, Britain's Unsung and Secret Defences on Land, Sea and in the Air. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the podcast, please consider becoming patron. Your support helps me continue to bring you more stories and insights from the Second World War. Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.